Your brain is you. Every thought, every emotion, every action comes from this one organ. But how well do you know it? The truth might surprise you. Many ancient cultures, like the Egyptians, believed the heart was actually the centre of all emotion and reason. It wasn't until 400 BC when Hippocrates discovered that it was actually the brain where our thoughts derived. However, as electricity had not yet been discovered, it was thought that it was actually a mechanical movement, just like the pump of a heart or the churn of your stomach. This led to a theory of humours that would flow through your brain, and all study was conducted to the empty parts of your brain rather than to the actual matter that makes it up. This was shown by Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century. He used wax moulds to map out the brain and was one of the first people in history to do this. Yet he believed so deeply in this idea of humours that he failed to actually study the matter of the brain and looked, as many people in the past have done, to the spaces. It took an Englishman, Thomas Willis, in the 17th century to take a look at the matter in the brain and start to think, maybe this is where thoughts come from, rather than the space between. He coined the term neurology, which we still use today for this study, yet he didn't discover the real way this matter is utilised. That was done by someone called Luigi Galvani. He discovered that you can make muscles move using electricity, so he theorised that this is the way that the brain works. It sends electrical signals from the brain to the different muscles to get them to move, which is, as we know today, exactly how things work. After World War II, soldiers would come back with brain injuries, and people started to look at these soldiers and they'd have different disabilities due to the different brain injuries they had, and they started to connect the dots. This person has this part of their brain injured, and this person also has this part of their brain injured, and they both display the same symptoms. Whereas this person has a different part of their brain injured, and they don't show those symptoms, but they show these other symptoms. This is when people started to realise that the brain was compartmentalised. Different parts did different things and had different functions. Nowadays, we have a bit more of an understanding of how this works due to PET scans and fMRIs. Despite all this innovation, it wasn't thought that the brain had cells for a very long time. Despite us knowing that the heart had cells, the stomach had cells, the brain, that was one that we thought for a very long time mustn't be made up of cells. Now we know that it is. It's actually made up of a cell called a neuron, which is a very, very small cell, hence why they couldn't find it for so long. Why is a neuron so small? Well, some animals, such as squids, actually have larger neurons, and we've seen that the electrical signals pass through those much quicker. But if you have bigger neurons, you can't have as many in the same space, and more neurons allows for more complex thought. How does a neuron work? Well, there's 3 different ways neurons actually convey information across the brain. The first is electrically, which I've already mentioned. When a neuron is inactive, it has a voltage of 70 millivolts. When there is a small electrical impulse applied to the neuron, then sodium will flow in from the surrounding area, and this sort of causes a chain reaction where it increases the electricity inside of the neuron. However, this releases different gates inside of the neuron, which makes the gates that let in sodium close, and then the gates that let out phosphorus open, so this dispels the charge. This is happening millions and millions of times inside your brain every second, all over your brain, making lots of different thoughts and decisions and perceiving different things. However, at these synapses, it can also convey information using chemicals. Now, electricity can flow both ways through the neurons, but it can only flow one way chemically. So there'll be a receiver neuron and there'll be a transmitter neuron, and it will flow from one to the other and it will be received. There is a third method, which is less discreet, which a neuron will release chemical throughout the brain, such as nitrous oxide, which can communicate with lots of different neurons at once. So now I've told you a little bit about how the brain works. You might be thinking, how did we get to this state? So the first cells likely had very little senses as we would describe them, yet the ones that did, the ones that could perceive threats and perceive rewards, would be able to gain an advantage as they would be able to live longer and reproduce and copy themselves more, and thus started evolution. This would culminate in lots of single-celled organisms with as advanced sensory capabilities as you can get with a single-celled organism. Then multicellular organisms arose, and this gave a massive advantage over singular-celled organisms as they could specialize. Some could be sensing, some could be motor, some could produce energy, and as these got more and more complex, evolution got more and more competitive. And as these organisms got bigger and bigger, some cells specialized to carry information from one side of the organism to the other. This was the beginning of what is now our spinal column, but with the development of the mouth, this made these organisms directional. Now there was one way where something would eat. This would generally be the front as it moved along. Therefore, all of the cells would start to bunch up onto one side to shorten the time between perceiving danger and acting. This is how our brain was formed. And so the brain has evolved a lot since then, and now there are four main parts which we have inside of our brain. So we have the spinal column, the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The first part of the brain is the one I've already mentioned, which is the spinal column. So signals from the brain come from the dorsal side, or the side closest to your back, and signals to the brain go on the ventral side, which is the side closest to your stomach. We then have the hindbrain, which is just for all of your unconscious and necessary bodily functions such as breathing, your heartbeat, and it can also help coordinate motor commands. Then we have the midbrain. It helps with voluntary movement, so if you were ever going to try and move your hands or go for a walk or anything like that, this part of the brain would activate. And it also helps with receiving sensory information such as hearing and seeing. We have the forebrain. This is where most of our thought processes happen. This is where most of our sensing and perceiving happens, and is really the most important part of the brain. So one of the parts of the forebrain is the thalamus, which controls the flow of sensory information. Another part is the hypothalamus, which controls so many different aspects of thought, such as emotions. This can release hormones and things like that. It also helps with hunger and thirst. This, along with the amygdala, are the oldest parts of the forebrain. You might refer to some people calling this the lizard brain, but weirdly enough, the amygdala is responsible for smell in reptiles, but emotions in humans. Finally, we have the hippocampus, which is the center of all emotions, and all of these are part of the corpus callosum, which is the part in the middle of your brain that connects the two hemispheres. So the rest of the forebrain is split up into 4 different parts, and then these 4 different parts are split down the middle to make the 2 different hemispheres of your brain. And the different hemispheres actually perform different functions. So we know that the left side of your brain is responsible for speaking, because if you separate the connection between the 2 hemispheres, if you show something to the right side of your body, so your right eye, which is controlled by your left hemisphere, then people with the split in the middle, they will be able to say what they see. Whereas you show it to their left eye, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, they won't be able to say what they see. One of the most important regions of the human brain is the frontal lobe, which is at the front, hence the name. And that is one of the biggest in the animal kingdom. It has evolved quite rapidly over the last few million years, and is responsible for language, reasoning, and ultimately what makes us human. Now you might think sensing and perceiving are the same thing, but in actuality they are 2 different things, and the way that your brain works demonstrates this really well. Not everything that is sensed is perceived, and not everything that is perceived is sensed. There's a video online you might have seen of a group of people passing around a basketball, and you're told to concentrate on how many times they pass the ball. And while you're concentrating on this and you're counting, a gorilla comes onto the screen. It's a man in a gorilla suit, and he does a little dance, and then he goes off the screen. And when I watched this, and many of the people that I spoke to didn't see the gorilla at all. And the explanation for this is that although our eyes perceived it, and that information was sent to the midbrain, it decided that because it wasn't part of the task we were doing, it wasn't important and it didn't send it to the forebrain, so we didn't consciously perceive it. But when something is perceived, how is it remembered? Well, there are two different types of memory, short-term and long-term, as I'm sure you've heard. So these two different types of memory are actually very different things. Short-term memory is a difference in phosphorus levels in the brain, which affects how the electrical signals travel through your brain. This is actually initiated by small amounts of serotonin, whereas long-term memory is initiated by large amounts of serotonin. But the difference here is that long-term memory is actually a physical change of your brain. It requires new cells to be created and new pathways between neurons to be created. Long-term memory can be split up into 4 different types. So we've got semantic knowledge, which is the knowledge of facts such as your name or the temperature that water boils at. Then we've got declarative knowledge, which is knowledge that helps you perform a task, such as navigation, where to go when you're traveling around town. We also have procedural or motor knowledge, which is the knowledge of how to perform tasks such as sewing or riding a bike. And then episodic memory, which is what most people would consider memory of events and the memory of how things happened. So different types of memories are actually stored in different parts of the brain. The hippocampus is responsible for that declarative knowledge I was mentioning, where it's easier to remember how to get around. This is actually shown in London taxi drivers. They have larger hippocampuses as the rest of us. But then procedural or motor knowledge is more in the basal ganglia and cerebellum. Our brains are highly adaptive, however, especially under the age of 25. Changes are quite easy to make, and changes are made by stimuli. The stronger the stimuli, the stronger the change. Now, one thing that people are always wondering about nowadays is if AI is ever going to overtake the intelligence of a human. And AI is categorically worse than a human brain. Data centers that run AI are absolutely massive and incredibly energy intensive. And when you imagine that most tasks an AI can do, a human can do just as well, if not maybe better, with a fraction of the energy and a fraction of the size, it starts to become apparent that computer scientists should be taking notes from neurobiologists on how to design these models and how to design the infrastructure that they're built on. However, machines can be very useful for providing aid to the brain. So there's 2 different types of machines that can help. There's ones that take in sensory information and then convert it into electrical information for the brain to perceive. And then there's ones that take electrical information from the brain and convert it into some sort of real world physical manifestation. So the first type would be something like a hearing aid. It takes sound from the real world, it then converts it into electrical signals for your brain to pick up. Then on the other side would be something like prosthetic limbs that can take signals from the brain and turn them into movements. So, in conclusion, most of the information that we get from the brain comes from fMRIs. And although these are incredibly useful tools, they only show us where blood flow is going and don't actually show us neuron activity. And so it's very difficult to get a full understanding of how the brain works. While this has given us a much better understanding of the brain than we did when we thought that the heart was the centre of thought, or that the liquids inside the brain were the main reason for thought, it isn't giving us a full picture, and studying individual parts of the brain don't really provide justice to how the whole brain works together and how different parts of the brain work in unison. Ultimately, we're very far off understanding how the brain works, and there's still many mysteries in how the thing that we used to think actually works. So that's everything I got from Michael O'Shea's A Very Short Introduction to the Brain. This is a very good book. It's very dense, so I've missed out quite a lot of the stuff in here. So if you want to pick it up, there's still lots more to learn. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've tried to convey this information as clearly as possible, and I'm by no means a neurobiologist, but I've learned a lot from this book and I feel like I've got a much better understanding of the brain. So thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, that's brilliant. Subscribe, like, comment, do all the YouTube things, and I'll see you in the next one.